Order. Well, good morning, colleagues, and welcome to our first evidence session on our inquiry into public bodies. Long talked about, often talked about, but sometimes not as deeply understood as they need to be. And it's a great pleasure to welcome as our first witness for this first session, Matthew Gill, who's the Programme Director on Public Bodies at the respected Institute for Government. Matthew, you're very welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Let me start by asking the red top populist question of the morning. Somebody Pat McFadden waves a magic wand and abolishes public and arm's length bodies, that whole range of them. When does society notice?
Well, I think pretty quickly. So these bodies do a whole range of things. You have organisations like the Post Office as a public corporation, which would sometimes be included in that definition. Regulators like the Food Standards Agency. Delivery bodies like DVLA, HM Prisons and Probations, Met Office. So financial regulators. And so if those organisations stop performing their functions, you would notice very quickly. What governments often do, though, is to change the governance structures, and you see this with the announcement on NHS England, for instance. That isn't abolishing the NHS, it's moving the governance from arm's length into the department. And I think then what you get into is a question about if government is going to continue to perform a function, how is it best governed? I think over time, if there were no arm's length bodies in this hypothetical, you would have difficulties, for instance, of demonstrating that some functions were being performed independently, that they were taking a sufficiently long-term view of some of the issues that they dealt with. In the case of some financial institutions, that they were dealing credibly with private sector counterparties rather than on behalf of government. So there are some reasons why that matters. I think you would also possibly end up in a situation where ministers would find themselves drowned in operational detail. And so whether it's within the structure of a public body or within the way that you structure governance in a department, it's quite important to think through how second and third order decisions are delegated away from ministerial private offices, because otherwise it's very difficult as a minister to step above that and think about the real political strategy that you're trying to achieve in government.
Why?
Because, I think we see this in the way private offices will work, in that if the minister is accountable, then there is always an option to escalate to the minister for decision. That option is often taken, and so ministers are, I think, notionally making, or their private offices tend to find themselves making far more decisions than they could sort of humanly be doing. I think you can also think that there are examples where you can see that aside from that volume of decision question, it might also sometimes be difficult for a minister to make the decision they might want to make without a little bit of distance. So an example would be there's an organisation called the Independent Reconfiguration Panel, which is set up in the health infrastructure to decide on the restructuring of hospitals and whether, for instance, a local hospital should be closed. And so there you might have quite a direct tension between the fact that, as a constituency MP, a politician is going to come under a lot of pressure to maintain the local hospital, but in most cases the clinical results are that outcomes are better if people go to larger regional hospitals where there are more specialist units able to deal with their problem rather than going to a local hospital.
But all the experts told us that about get rid of community and cottage hospitals, and that's what's led to a huge problem in bed blocking in the acute sector. Isn't the problem here that in essence the doing of politics by politicians has either been passported away to avoid taking difficult decisions, or because somebody has advocated for there's a problem, there's an issue, and the best thing is to go and find 3 or 4 people who know something about it, set up a body and let them crack on and do something. Can one just not argue that the whole landscape has been created as a result of abdication? Because I don't take your point, I'm afraid, on the ministerial time. Ministers find time to do things. The diary is a wide open prairie, and quite a lot of ministerial time is taking up with things which make not a ha'porth of difference, but it just fills the time when they could actually be becoming experts in things and taking long-term decisions.
I mean, it's no doubt variable, but there's certainly a lot of experience amongst people working in government that decisions that are not at the top of the news can take quite a considerable time to progress through private offices. That is true.
We know that there are around 300 ALBs, but how many public bodies are there?
Well, that's a definitional question.
Thank you, Sir Humphrey.
Well, and actually, because it's a definitional question, there isn't actually. I can't give you a clear answer.
Nobody can.
No, it isn't out there. So the Office for National Statistics classifies public sector bodies as central government, local government, or public corporations. So they have sort of that classification, and within that central government classification, you get the Cabinet Office doing the classification as arm's length bodies. That doesn't include public corporations, which I think you could easily include. It also
when you say public corporations, you're talking about
BBC, Channel 4, Post Office, that kind of thing. And there are also quite a number of unclassified bodies which either predate the classification framework or have not yet been classified, that the Cabinet Office doesn't have oversight of. So if you go on gov.uk, you get a list of about 580, excluding departments of. But that also includes units in government, which are not ALBs. So you have units in government, then you have executive agencies, which are part of the department but institutionally separate, non-departmental public bodies, which have a separate legal personality, non-ministerial departments, public corporations. Add all of that together, and you get into the low 400s. Add units that the Cabinet Office lists, you get to 580. And so I think there's a strong case for government looking more closely at that landscape rather than just the 305. But if you go beyond that to devolved administrations, local government, it's a much bigger number.
That's nothing to be proud of, is it, really?
Not necessarily. I mean, I don't think it's something to be proud or unproud of. I think
things which are using public monies, which are taking decisions, setting strategies, opining on X, Y, and Z. And I mean, I'm not blaming you for the multiplicity of definitions and terminologies, etc. But for an advanced, mature democracy with a large senior civil service, most people out there, if you go back to your bit about hospital reorganisation, a local hospital is under threat of closure. Members of the public write to their Member of Parliament. The Member of Parliament writes to the Minister. The Minister says there's nothing to do with me because it's all passported off to somebody else. There's a lot of folk just out there who are working hard paying their taxes, who just scratch their head in perplexity and go, well, who governs Britain? And I'm not rehearsing the Ted Heath 1974 election thing, but who governs Britain?
I mean, quite understandably, and the landscape is, it's definitely fair to say, unnecessarily complex. That is true. It has arisen over a very long historical period, going back to, I mean, you know, the British Museum, the Bank of England, hundreds of years ago, preceding many government departments. And so this has evolved gradually. I guess since the 1970s, the number of public bodies has been very significantly reduced. And so even from 2010, you would have been able to count 800. According to the Cabinet Office definition, it's now down to just over 300. But the landscape that is there is certainly complicated. I think the question you then have is, given that long historical development, what to do about it? A lot of these bodies are set up in legislation, so it is possible to, for instance, pass a Public Bodies Act, which would enable the simplification of some of this landscape. It's also possible to say, actually, functionally, we don't want this to matter very much, and we want to just create clarity on each of these bodies and how they're operating, what their role is in setting its own strategic or policy framework, whether its board is advisory or fiduciary, whether it's staffed by civil servants or public servants, whether it has a distinct legal personality, how it bids for and allocates funding, for instance. And you can make decisions along these parameters and achieve some consistency in the way that you view the bodies without necessarily undoing the taxonomy. But, the Institute for Government has argued previously that taxonomy does not make a great deal of sense, and it will be a worthwhile exercise to revisit it, but it is a lot of work.
Yes, I can almost hear somebody writing a submission to a minister to say there should be a public body to look at public bodies, which would be slightly unfortunate. Peter.
Thank you. I think we'll get into the question of taxonomy and definitions later. It does seem like you set out a very broad potential definition, and I think within that we've got to set the greater range of reasons potentially as to why an arm's length body might exist. But in terms of the much more sort of narrow perception with bodies directly reporting into government, things like Natural England, Sport England, of that type, it does seem to me from what you set out, the two explanations as to why we might have a public body are that it's politically difficult to take a decision, in which case I feel desperately huge amount of sympathy for the minister, but that is actually their job. Or alternatively, that we've come up with this situation where we believe the ministers haven't got the time to do these roles. Now, I was the leader of a local authority for quite a long time. That the pressure for things to go to me was with officers rather than because the decision had to be taken at my level, and we put in place a cascading scheme of delegation which enabled people to have the confidence to take a decision without having to go to a private office. It doesn't seem to me to be on the wit of man that we could come up with a similar thing within central government which would enable decisions to be taken at an appropriate level without gumming up government, without having to set up hundreds of additional bodies at great cost to the taxpayer.
Great, let's do that.
Excellent. I'm glad we agreed.
That's the challenge, isn't it? And I think that with, for instance, something like NHS England being abolished now, it doesn't mean that you don't need a structure. Yeah. You're going to have to rebuild a structure within the government department that's going to have delegations, going to have areas of responsibility, there's going to be directorates, and sometimes those things can be less transparent. If you haven't got a board, if you haven't got public KPIs to hold an organisation to account to, you've just got a division in a department. Yes, in some ways there's a closer line management by the minister, although I think the extent to which that's true, particularly of executive agencies, is not well understood anyway. But it doesn't get you out of this question of how to organise the state to say we no longer want it to be configured as a public body.
Okay, John.
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning, Mr. Gill. In relation to those public bodies which are out with the sort of direct ministerial control, do you think the public understand that and understand it's not politicians and ministers who ultimately make these decisions?
Certainly not always, and ministers are often finding themselves, and I think this is where some of the frustration comes from. It is ministers will find themselves being held publicly accountable for things that they don't feel that they're in direct control of. I have full sympathy with that, and I think it's really difficult situation. I think there's a question that we may come on to about what to do about that and how to respond to it. But I think that the question of understanding that the bodies are outside of ministerial control is partly that that's not understood. It's partly that that's not the case. So ministers do have quite considerable controls over some of these bodies. Executive agencies, as I said, are directly line managed by departments. Arm's length body chief executives, even if they're not line managed, are often accounting officers reporting to the principal accounting officer, will be the permanent secretary in the department, who obviously is then accountable to the minister. Chairs of public bodies can be sort of summoned to Parliament. There can be, and the positions of leaders of these bodies can, as we have seen recently, become untenable if they are not acting in the way that the government expects. So I think there are controls, but they're controls with limits. And the details of those, in terms of what the escalation process is and who makes which decisions, vary by body and are set out usually in a framework document between the body and the department. And if often people who are involved don't know those framework documents in great detail, so expecting the general public to is unreasonable. But there's often quite complex provisions as to who makes which decisions in them.
Does it not just feed the frustration that voters have that it doesn't matter who you vote for, decisions are being made by people who are ultimately unaccountable and not the MPs or the ministers or indeed the Prime Minister even? Do you accept that? It feeds that frustration that voters have, that decisions are being made by people who are not directly electing? Yes,
I mean... But I think you need then you need to work out what your strategy of government is. If we reduce this ad absurdum, you would end up saying that every decision must be made by a politician. So let's say, take for instance rail, where part of the reason for setting up Great British Railways, as I understand it, is that there are hundreds of people in the Department for Transport working on some quite detailed aspects of rail policy. For instance, which entrances to which platforms should be opened at which times at which stations. Some of that sort of thing is under government control at the moment. Now, it is clearly, do you want elected politicians to make every decision at that level of detail, or do you want to delegate it, would be the question. And if you delegate it, you're either delegating it to a civil servant whom the public can be encouraged to mistrust, or you're delegating it to a public body with a leadership and governance structure whom the public can be encouraged to mistrust. So I think what you have to do is tackle that public perception that anybody in government who's not directly elected is illegitimate, and work out what the management structure is from politicians downwards that ensures that politicians have accountability, that government is accountable to politicians to deliver against their objectives, but nonetheless that the system works. If you don't do that, the thing is unworkable, I think.
I wanted to dwell a little bit just about Scotland. You said it's quite hard to define what a public body is. There was a freedom of information request put into the Scottish Government which revealed there's 130 of these public bodies, or quangos, which is how they were described, which has increased about 10% in the last 10 years, and it costs the taxpayer £6.6 billion per year. And David Hamilton, who you may know as Information Commissioner, recently told the Scottish Parliament's corporate body that he was astonished by the sheer volume of public bodies. He said there are literally hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of public bodies, and we keep finding new ones, he said. He went on to say that he and Stephen Boyle, who's the Auditor General, said they played public authority bingo, asking, have you heard of this one? Have you heard of that one? I mean, does it just not sound a bit chaotic to you in terms of, particularly, obviously that is Scotland, I suspect it's very similar for the UK government, but does it just not sound just a little bit chaotic and out of control and lacking in accountability?
I fully agree. And not out of control and lacking accountability. Chaotic at the level of the taxonomy, for historical reasons, yes. I think then the question is what to do about this. We have past experience of exercises which have looked to reduce the number of public bodies as an end in itself. So we did that in 2010 to 2015, for instance.
Didn't work though. I mean, that fails.
Well, it worked in the sense that the number of bodies went down, but the functions that government performed were not significantly reduced. The cost to the taxpayer was reduced moderately, and so what you risk doing is sort of moving things around and reconfiguring things. So there's I think, a very valid point that where you have lots of small bodies, as you describe, it may be possible to either bring them together into a smaller number of larger bodies, or one may be able to achieve the same efficiencies by providing back office functions or shared services in a way that enables them to run more effectively. And wherever that can be done, it should be done. But having a shorter list is not an end in itself, I would say.
You mentioned there that they had accountability. How can an organisation be deemed to be accountable when people don't know it exists?
Well, who doesn't know it exists?
Mr. Lamont has just quoted public body bingo being played by two people who...
Auditor General.
The Auditor General is no, wet behind the ears newbie.
So polemically, I could question, well, if it's possible for the Scottish Government not to know that a body exists and for it to be performing a set of functions that ministers aren't even aware of, is it really possible for them to directly run that? Rather than having it at arm's length if they don't even know that function is being performed at all.
It's a bit of an Alice in Wonderland answer. I'm doing something that you didn't know needed to be done, and I think I can do it better than you, so let me get on with it.
Yeah. So in that situation, I guess you would say either if you've identified a body that you didn't know existed, you could look at it and say, well, that's doing something pointless, let's close it. Absolutely fine, do that. Or you could say, I think there's a failure of accountability here because I didn't know it exists. I want to receive more information on it, or be briefed on it, or I want to combine it into a body that I do see more regularly, so that I see that information. I imagine what is happening in those situations is that there will be sponsorship teams in the government departments responsible for that body who are overseeing it, and it's just not escalated up to the Minister's office because it's been unremarkable, most probably. I think it's perfectly legitimate for the Minister to want to know more and to ask to know more about anything that's going on in the department. But that's probably how that arises. It's not necessarily that there isn't a mechanism of accountability, it's just that nothing's happened to be escalated.
So just to dive back in that, so in the scenario where something went catastrophically wrong by that quango or public body which was undertaking those functions, which had been kept distant from the Minister's private office, and that catastrophic mistake is made, do you think the Minister should have to resign in that scenario, or is there such a distance between those who are carrying out that function from the actual political master that they are safe from accountability?
This is very difficult, and I know, so there's lots to say about that. One thing would be to say, ideally, you would want the division of labour to be really clear there, so that the Minister, acting through the department, had set the objectives and the framework that governed that organisation so that it was clear what it should have been doing. If what it should have been doing was completely the wrong way up and it was trying to deliver on a political steer that was clearly not going to work, and that was the cause of the blow-up, that is a ministerial issue. If the body had just failed to deliver against the objectives that it had been set and had not escalated the problem and had not tried to deal with it, then that should be the body's issue. Now, that level of clarity in terms of what objectives are you setting, how are you holding people to account for delivery on them, that's the kind of thing, I think, where you do absolutely need ministerial involvement and grip on how the system works. And you need that whether it's a public body or a departmental directorate, I think. Now, in that situation where there's an accident, everybody has in good faith tried to do that and something has gone wrong and you can't parse that out, then you're in a really crunchy and difficult situation. And I guess, yes, it's the role of the Minister ultimately to take some accountability for that alongside the public body leadership. But you want to minimise the situations in which that's the case I think.
But in the court of public opinion,
yeah,
the voter would automatically presume, and would be right to do so, that it's the minister, either practical or titular, whose head will either sink or swim.
Yeah, and in some extreme cases, I mean, obviously, ultimately, that accountability is there. I mean, an analogy would be to take a very large corporate, for instance. If you're the chair of, I don't know, a large company, and you've got an underperforming subsidiary somewhere, or some crisis blows up. Say there's an environmental disaster somewhere. Even though you have delegated and legitimately delegated responsibility for that thing somewhere, you may still be the person who has to take public accountability. And as a leader, you want to minimise the number of situations in which that comes back to you. And I guess my submission to you is that the way to minimise the number of situations in which you're in that position is not to try and micromanage everything that goes on in the multinational, by this example, or in the government. It's to get the transmission of your political steers, expectations, objectives right through the system so that in 99.9% of cases, things run as they should. And there is always a risk of something going wrong, and there is always accountability landing where somebody did not have direct agency.
But organisations such as the Environment Agency, Natural England, can legitimately turn around to ministers now and say, well, that's frightfully interesting, Minister. Those are not our policies. And effectively, you can't tell us what to do. Mm. In a parliamentary democracy, that can't be. You used the word earlier about you can make things sound legitimate or illegitimate. That cannot be the most legitimate way of dealing with the governance of this country.
I think it depends on the question, and it is ultimately for ministers to delegate those powers to bodies. So, I mean, if you take, for instance, the health service, irrespective of any reorganisation, you would want the decision as to who receives medical care to be out of the hands of politicians. You wouldn't want to make a decision about which individual receives an operation and which individual doesn't, because that would be...
Yeah, but you might want ministers to decide whether certain treatments should be available across the board.
Right, absolutely. And so then in the sort of the Natural England example, you would be saying, do we want that organisation to have, I mean, as in the examples that have come up, a veto on planning applications, or do we want it to have, a right to make a submission in planning applications, or do we want it to have a wholly advisory role to government, or what do we want it to do? So I think in a situation where an organisation like that has powers that seem to you
self-authored
or excessive, they can be changed. But the thing to do is to change the powers.
Ministers have tried. They have. I've got Luke, Richard, and then Peter. Luke first, I think.
Thank you. It sounds as in the answer to the previous question that a lot of it's about comms and explanation and demystifying what the roles and responsibilities are, and where the accountability sits for the decisions that are made. How do you think the government, the media, bodies like the IFG can help with communicating better this process and this system of arm's length bodies to effectively demystify how this huge mush of 300 to an unknown number of groups and bodies fit together to create the governance of so many of our essential services, the Environment Agency, NHS England, or will soon be gone. But what can we do better to explain and to communicate where decisions sit and where mistakes have been made quite often?
I think I want to say that communication role is I mean, it's partly about the sort of the public narrative. I think the kind of the bonfire of the quangos, or the kind of, this sort of language is not helpful and makes people feel hostile towards organisations in government. So I think I would try and avoid that kind of pejorative language publicly where possible. I think I would then, on an organisation by organisation basis, want to be clear, what is it that this organisation is doing for the public? What are its roles and responsibilities? And start the communication from there. In a way that the kind of conversation we're having about the plumbing and the governance should be had a little bit separately to the conversation about what the body as constituted is actually doing and whether it's doing it well or not. So maybe it's a little bit about separating those two things.
Broadly, the language and the debate quite often degrades into, abolishing these, Jobsworths who are doing nothing and add nothing to our process. We need to smash all the quangos.
Yeah.
That actually quite directly detracts from the understanding of how they fit together and the roles that they perform.
I think so, and it can also be, we've certainly heard from interviews that we've done that it can be demoralising to people working in them because they think that, they're kind of viewed as a necessary evil at best, and that, whereas actually, people want to come to work in a spirit of public service and do good and feel motivated that they're valued.
Peter.
Yeah, and we should take the moment, I think, just to reflect on the fact that there are many people who work for this government in those roles who are doing fantastic work on behalf of the public. The challenge here is how that interfaces, I believe, with the government in general and particularly with democratic oversight. And this idea that ministers have control, I'm going to push back a bit on, if you read any recent biography by any recent minister, the level of frustration at not being able to take decisions because some unselect body apparently has been tasked with doing that, is quite palpable. Now, theoretically, I suppose anything which is in statute you can revoke using a statute. But the knock-on effect is I've got voters, and Natural England is a great example for my mind because it's creating absolute havoc in my area at the moment. I've dealt with them extensively. If you're a resident in Crawley who's desperate for a house, you come to see your MP to try and unfreeze the pipeline on getting housing built. He goes to see the minister. The minister says it's actually not within my purview, it's within the body of the external agency. I don't have direct control over it, would need to pass separate legislation that require a majority of this House. The level of impact is very much that actually members of the public exercising their democratic rights have extremely minimal impact through this system, through to actually things that might affect their day-to-day quality of life. And I think that's corroding our democracy, to be quite frank. I think a lot of what we saw on Thursday are knock-on effects of the fact that people are desperately frustrated that these problems they're told are incredibly complicated and it has been handed off to these other bodies and as a result we can't do anything about it, whereas they just want the problem solved. So my question would be, is there really genuine value being added by having decision-making taken at that level rather than, as you set out, that alternatively it could be done in an advisory capacity?
It depends on the case. Would be my answer, and I recognise that it's difficult once a system is in place to change it, and that's why it's so important to get these things right when they're set up. I think the kind of example, and there are others, but to pick on the example of the independent reconfiguration panel that I gave. In a way, the panel exists to take decisions that would be hard for a minister to make outside of the ministerial sphere. And so the political decision is to say, we want these decisions to be based on clinical outcome, rather than the political decision being, we want this hospital to be in this place. And so you're characterising the political decision in a different way and then setting up a body that institutionalises that political decision that you've made. So I would characterise that not as ministers, politicians not making the decision, but as them constraining themselves on a day-to-day basis to achieve a greater good that they aspire to. You see this also with, I guess, some of the investment bodies. So take the British Business Bank or the UK Infrastructure Bank, now the National Wealth Fund, which are set up to make investments. And I mean, there's a separate point that they need to be credible counterparties in the market and therefore separate from government. But they're also making investments and decisions that will go well beyond the political cycle in terms of where they invest money. And in some respects, you set up those organisations to take the immediate pressure to have a particular investment in a particular short-term way in a particular area off the table of individual members of Parliament or ministers, and to align it with a longer-term strategic view that ministers have signed up to. And so these should best be conceived as different mechanisms of achieving the political will, but achieving what you want over the long term involves imposing some constraints on the system.
It's behind the veil of ignorance thing. We'd all agree to these concepts heading in, and the outcomes, unfortunately, as they are, for the particular area are beneficial overall.
Well, right, or I mean, there will be situations where you want to unpick it. You do it wrong and you want to unpick it. I'm not denying that at all. But in situations where it's working well, you would still expect there to be friction, and you would expect as an individual member of Parliament or minister to be thinking, I wish I could decide this because somebody is pressuring me at the constituency level to do this thing. That's not a symptom of the system not working.
No, with great respect, a minister would have to recuse themselves from any decision in their own constituency.
Well, or feeling pressure from colleagues or pressure on the short-term versus long-term point then. Yeah.
I mean...
But apologies, yeah.
Sorry, had you finished?
Yeah.
That's a pretty low assessment of ministers. And most people will be attracted to join a profession, a vocation, a job, being a member of Parliament, for what can I do? What could I write what would be written in my obituary? What have I done? Well, I slightly cajoled a couple of public bodies to move this way or the other, or I had regular meetings to be briefed on what they were thinking of doing, is not exactly something to get the angels singing some sort of celestial hymn of praise. Has the body politic, this place as an institution, and ministers just sort of lost confidence in themselves to do the job at hand and just thought, oh, there's somebody out there who is able to think long-term, strategically and dispassionately, which is all actually part of the ministerial code in any event?
I hope not.
We have, haven't we? It's a debasing of politics and direct engagement through democratically accountable decision-making. Over time, of governments of all colours.
I mean, I think, this is something I was going to say about this landscape as well. You have to go back to the 1980s to really see a very clear vision for change in the public bodies landscape with Next Steps and the advent of the executive agency, where there was a clear view across government that, we don't want things or more than has to be at arm's length in non-departmental public bodies, but we do want to disaggregate delivery within departments and have people with private sector expertise leading delivery bodies within departments to do certain functions. And that was a clear vision as to what was needed here that was driven. I mean, since then, I think there's been quite a lot of drift. And I think both towards a gradual shortening of the arm in some respects, also towards a tendency to want to reduce the number of bodies in some respects. But what is missing is a clear strategy as to what do we think the role of this kind of body is and isn't in government. And that's absolutely for ministers to provide. It's not, they can ask the civil service for input and advice, but that's the level at which I think there really is a gap and an opportunity for political leadership if people want to take it. Now, you can, of course, also form a principled view that the right approach to this is incrementalist. But you should absolutely be coming to that view clear-eyed and with the full authority of a democratic mandate.
It's more sedimentary, isn't it? It's just sort of build it. I mean, we have a situation, if there's a difficult thing for a department, we'll passport it to the Cabinet Office. And the Cabinet Office has given us evidence to say that they're now very determinedly pushing back on that. Oh, there's something coming up that might be a bit tricky. Oh, I know what we'll do. We'll set up a arm's length body or a quango, and that will sort of de-sting it, and then we can say, well, we're doing something.
That's a bad reason for setting one up.
Yeah. But it's just built up. Oh, well, we have a culture of.
Yeah.
Without anybody ever pausing and stepping back and going, is this fit for purpose? In some instances, it may still be, but not across the piece.
Absolutely.
Would you agree that it shouldn't be driven by how many scalps? We've abolished 52, or we've saved X. Is the correct question that should be asked is, does its abolition, or change of its terms of reference or something, does its reform improve transparency, accountability, and better governance?
Yes, that's absolutely the right question. That doesn't always mean a direct transmission of individual decisions from ministers, but yes, that's the right question.
Mr. Taylor, I think you're coming on question 3.
So we hear quite often, I think it reflects the opening question about kind of the red top headline, which is that we have too many public bodies, and I think that's reflected in the opinions of government and most political parties as well. We then see governments forming new ones as they absorb old ones, and a constant kind of flux and flow. Why is it that this seems to be how it always seems to go?
I guess there's always some churn, and what you tend to find is that the more recently established bodies are the ones that are most likely to be abolished as well.
Interesting.
So, if you look back to 2010, there's been between 2 and 12 bodies set up sort of every year, whatever the colour of the government, actually, because there'll be things that come up that they want to do, and that was happening even while the headline number was being radically reduced in the early 2010s. So in a way, I would sort of look at the fact that there are always going to be a small number being set up to pursue certain policy objectives separately to the.
Can I? Is that because the many are set up for short-term tasks that they then serve and become redundant, or is it because they are set up and then actually they decide they're not functioning in the way they're intended to, or actually we're going to do it slightly differently, or is it a combination of both?
It can be a combination of that and others. So one case study that we looked at a couple of years ago was the Independent Commission on Civil Aviation Noise, which was established and then abolished within a period of about 2 years. Right. And part of the reason that happened was because when it was initially established, it was not clear what it was for. Was it trying to manage stakeholders? Was it trying to advise governments? Was it acting with some authority in this area? Was it trying to achieve a certain policy outcome or legitimise a certain policy outcome? And that was never agreed between everybody, and then therefore it couldn't deliver against its objectives because its objectives weren't clear, and then it was found not to have done so, somewhat inevitably. So I think the lesson from that on setting one up is just be really, really clear what it's for, and not just in your own mind, but clear that there is sufficient agreement around it, and that agreement is politically sustainable. I mean, you could take the Trade Remedies Authority, for instance, which has survived, but has survived in a different form. Its decision-making authority has been reduced, and it is more advisory after the controversy on steel in 2021, which was one of the first cases that it looked at. And I think there you sort of see a need to be realistic about whether this body can perform XYZ function independently, and whether that's going to hold or not.
You mentioned the lesson here is that bodies need to be clear on what they're trying to deliver and, deliver against those metrics.
And government needs to be clear.
Yeah. How do you? How is that? Is there a central body? Is there a set of terms of reference templates that are used to guide the establishment of arm's length bodies that individual departments kind of refer back to? Is there a commissioner of standards for this? How are we learning these lessons is, I guess, what I'm kind of trying to get to. How are they implemented into Whitehall so that when these bodies are spun out, you're not kind of half-forming them and dooming them to failure?
So there is guidance from the Cabinet Office on how to do this. There's also expertise in UK GI on it. The Institute for Government, we wrote a paper at the end of last year on how to set up a public body with lessons learnt and case studies in terms of how to do this well or badly. I would say there is a gap, though. There's certainly space for an ongoing collection of lessons learned and best practice on how to do these things well. And I think brokering between people who've done it before, be that through mentoring or other connections, into people who are doing it now, because it is a specific skill set to get some of these things going with the legislation that may or may not be required, the organisational change, etc. And so I think there's more that could be done to bring, if you like, expertise together and then deploy it when these things are being set up.
I guess the follow-up point I've got here actually fits quite nicely. Is it too easy to establish new arms length bodies badly at the moment? And how do we stop that process from continuing to churn out poorly defined groups?
I mean, there was NAO research a few years ago saying that the business cases for bodies were not always prepared properly or reviewed properly in the process of doing this. I think our solution to that, in the way that we've thought about it, and we may come on to talk about the three tests later, but was to say actually sometimes these decisions are made at an earlier stage. So by the time you're preparing a very detailed business case and going through all of the formal approvals and such that do exist within government, so that there are quite rigorous processes that these things go through, but they are sometimes happening after the fact of the kind of the initial political decision or steer, at least, that this is the direction in which we want to go. So you're not going to invest in producing a, often very significant business case unless there's a clear steer that is worth doing. So the thing that matters is making sure that some of the kinds of considerations that we're discussing this morning come into play at that earliest possible stage, so that you make sure you're not just setting up a body to manage a set of stakeholders or to make an issue go away, but doing it for reasons that make conceptual sense. And so, we've proposed some tests that we think will help do that better in future.
Thank you. Mr. Quigley.
I'm Mr. Gill. Just following on from that, is it a case that it's just easier and faster to set up these bodies than it is to do it in department, do you think?
Usually not. It's often quite a lot more work than people realise to set up the body, for reasons of recruitment, premises, negotiating the mission, any legislation that might be required. So it is usually quite a process. There are ways of making that more efficient through shared services and such, but doing something in a department is usually quicker and easier.
In your written submission, thank you for that, you've suggested there's scope for a more developed central policy on public bodies. But do you think that's possible where the Cabinet Office is responsible for overall public bodies and the policy, but departments are responsible for the public bodies they sponsor? What's that?
It was a flotilla organised.
Oh yes, it is, yeah. Sorry. Do you think that is possible where the Cabinet Office is responsible for overall public bodies policy, but departments are responsible for the public bodies they sponsor?
It's difficult. The Cabinet Office, and we found this in work that we did on public appointments, actually, where the Cabinet Office can set up a system to track public appointments and try and speed them up. But it can't actually make departments use that system. It can only offer it. And that's because individual secretaries of state obviously have control over their departments. And that's right and proper. And so the Cabinet Officer's role is sort of a convening role across that. And ultimately their authority would have to come from political agreement driven by senior politicians if it was necessary. But they try and do a lot of their work without the need for that. So a lot of their work on public bodies is in that space. And I think that there certainly is scope, as I've said, for convening more practical expertise in some of these areas, developing the new tests for when public bodies should exist. I think there's potential for them to look at some of the outdated legislation that exists for bodies, and there's some quite striking examples of that going back decades where bodies are constrained by legislation that there just isn't parliamentary time or appetite or the right bill to be able to sort out. And then sort of wider data monitoring on the wider range of bodies we discussed at the start, so the unclassified bodies, public corporations, as well as the subset of ALBs. So some of that could be done to a greater extent, probably within current structures, but it would require resource. So the teams in the Cabinet Office doing that, which they don't currently have. I think the other question to ask is to what extent you think it's necessary for the Cabinet Office to have a strong view, both in terms of data and policy across the piece, or whether their role is to be really confident that departments have that. You might say from the landscape that you've observed that it's not clear that departments do, and therefore some central coordination is necessary, but that is the alternative for the Cabinet Office to assure itself that departments are doing this rigorously.
Thank you. And you mentioned new tests, because the current tests are whether the role they perform is highly technical or requires a degree of objectivity or political impartiality that warrants being put at some distance from their sponsored department. How consistently are those tests applied, and what would you want the new tests to be?
They're well known, the tests, and they're certainly quoted in the review programs that public bodies go through, and public bodies are asked to justify themselves against those tests each time they are reviewed. However, the predecessor of this committee, the Public Administration Select Committee, even when those tests were first set up, expressed doubt that, and I quote, they had been properly thought through or were capable of clear definition. And you see that in the technical function test. When is the expertise external that it's describing? How do you really disaggregate the two impartiality and independence tests? So it seems to me that it's very difficult to apply them consistently because they're not all that clear. And then you have a choice. Either you say, well, let's just not have the test, let's rely on a business case. I would argue against that. Because the business case comes too late. I think it's important to have a rough, if you like, proxy for a business case at the earliest stage of decision making. And so then our proposal for reframing the test is really from that perspective, to say how can we have three tests that give you the best kind of rule of thumb proxy to a business case when you have that first initial meeting or discussion of whether to set up a body. And so the tests that we proposed were about effectiveness. Would this body perform the function more effectively, or would it make government as a whole more effective to have this in the body? Independence. Is independence from ministerial decision making important for the particular decision this body is making? And then cost efficiency. In the long term, can it be shown to be cheaper when you consider the transition and steady state to do things at arm's length rather than to do it in the department? Or if not, is there some clear justification for that cost being incurred? And so that's designed really to to replicate the thought process you would go through producing a business case in very truncated form, and to allow for situations where you might want to do things at arm's length, long-term decision making in the case of the railways, the hospitals example we've discussed, interaction with private sector counterparties in the case of the banks, sometimes even a route to potential privatisation. You want to test an incubator function and then spin it off into the private sector, as happened with the Green Investment Bank, for instance. Alongside that, there's also a criterion that sits alongside the three tests, which is that public bodies should be a last resort. And I think that has, in the past, led to some misguided abolitions. And you could quote the Audit Commission, UK Border Agency, arguably PHE, certainly in terms of timing, if not structure, in that. And so I'd remove that criteria, but instead use those kind of three tests that I've described as a way of disciplining what's being done.
And do you think public bodies help or hinder the government's mission-led approach?
I think it's early to say. I think the question there is probably what level of authority they have across government, because some of the missions are quite cross-cutting across departments. And so if you have a body set up to pursue a mission, the question is probably going to be how effectively can it work across government, and what are the levers there, and whether it's reliant on its department to engage in negotiations across the piece. So I think that would probably be quite important.
Thank you.
What happens if you have, so there's a mission just to deliver more housing. Then you have a number of public bodies who will have a say, influence or whatever. Natural England, statutory consultee, the Environment Agency, another statutory consultee, Homes England, and a whole raft of others in terms of health providers and so on and so forth. It's quite easy, in inverted commas, to get that non-siloisation of the government approach. How likely is it to see a similar approach in certain missions where there are a number of public bodies with elements of responsibility to either frustrate or assist delivery?
Yeah. I mean, it can be hard where you've got a more complex range of bodies. I mean, I think there are examples certainly of public bodies and regulators working together. The Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum is often cited, where some of the big regulators in the digital space work together on how they're going to operate. The way the FCA, PRA, Treasury work together is another example. So it's possible for these organisations to have very close sort of working relationships. I think in the example you give on housing, where you have bodies that have only a tangential interest in housing but quite a significant impact on whether it actually happens, you can consider changing the objectives of those organisations in terms of saying, well, they should have regard to X, Y, Z, which is the kind of thing the government's doing more broadly when it says that regulators should have regard to the growth objective, for instance. You can, I think I would ask the body that question, how it is going to make that work. And if the answer is, we're not going to make that work, that's not acceptable. If the answer is, our legislation or terms of reference or objectives don't allow us to make that work, then change them. But I think it can be quite granular and just needs working through.
Because it depends whether they see themselves as servant of government,
Yeah.
or some sort of keeper of the sacred flame conscience of government. we're there to keep you on the path of, on the straight and narrow, or we are here to flex and bend to meet the fluctuations of government aspiration.
Public bodies will usually be trying sincerely to do the latter, or should be, but they will have it in mind that ultimately their sort of legal obligations, if it's in legislation, is to pursue their objectives. So if they've been set up with particular objectives, they will pursue those, and they will try and adapt to a political steer to the extent that that is consistent with those objectives.
So is that of itself a hindrance to fleet-of-footness, rapidity, if you will, of response, where you have important organisations constrained by legislation, which only legislation can alter, and governments and ministers, particularly they're not exclusively at a change of government moment, that wants to reset the clock, set off in a new direction, and finds itself constrained by, well, we would love to be able to help you on this, but we can't, because our legislative remit doesn't allow us to do so. You as legislators will have to go back and do it, by which point, by the time you've done that, the opportunity has come, gone, and been exploited by somebody else or missed.
Yeah, it can be. And so then I think the challenge then is that, well, how can you design organisations and legislation that are more nimble or more changeable, if you like? Because I think if the revealed preference over time is that successive governments are likely to want to make changes to bodies, then it becomes a question of designing them in such a way that those changes are easier to make. And that could be, from the point of view, the legislation is one thing, but common terms and conditions of staff, platforms for finance and HR and IT that are interchangeable, so that you can reconfigure organisations more easily than at present. I think there's a lot of work that could be done to make that easier, if that's desirable.
Okay, so is there a quick question? Is there any upside desirability to, if setting up these organisations or reviewing their existence, to remove the sort of policy constraining, response constraining legislative straitjacket and make them more accountable to ministers and Parliament by effectively being able to be given a fresh set of marching orders by a minister on an agreed public policy and say, you're now responsible for delivering whatever it is?
I mean, the downside of doing that, I guess, would be you are probably taking power away from Parliament and putting it towards ministers when you do that, if less is in legislation.
Won't be a shock to anybody who spent any time on the backbenches.
No, but then, with things like, particularly where there are bodies that oversee government, for instance, like, I don't know, the OPR or the NAO, you would want there to be ultimate parliamentary accountability and control over those organisations, as distinct from ministers and departments. I think I'd also refer back to the point about sort of long-term decision-making, and there are two aspects to this. One is it being a legitimate political decision to try and enable the state to take decisions that go beyond the electoral cycle. But I think also sometimes, and this is the chicken and egg of the point about making things easier to reconfigure, it's really costly and disruptive to reconfigure stuff, or can be. And so a disincentive to that is not always an unhelpful thing, because the evidence as to whether performing functions inside government departments or performing them at arm's length works better is varied case by case. You can make an argument for, I think it's clear that things at subscale are less efficient, but once you get beyond a certain scale, there are examples both ways. But what is always clear is that when you make the change from one to the other, senior leadership gets embroiled in that for a considerable period of time, and it takes a lot of bandwidth and causes a lot of distraction. So the sort of one clear finding from our work is that the disruption and change is problematic.
But there's also if the stability has had any particularly distinguished upturns. I mean, speaking back to a point, Mr. Gill, that you were talking about earlier about sort of, long-term strategic. Well, we know that we've got a crisis in terms of reservoir capacity. We know that the grid is just about managing, and we've seen risks to it in terms of, inhibiting development or economic expansion, etc. And if everything under the current governance operational model was working like a, finely tuned Formula One racing car, we might be, one might be saying, well, it's all working perfectly, leave it all alone. But it seems that neither way is working particularly well.
No, and I mean, I guess in that sort of question that you raised, which is about kind of investment in infrastructure, you would look back over the last couple of decades and say that there was a lot of focus on keeping consumer bills down and introducing competition in markets. And that, in a way, the kind of regulatory expertise that you need to do those things is not the same as perhaps the sort of prudential expertise you would need to spot the potential incentives in markets to extract value from companies or the risks if the energy market moved in a particular way. And so I think you would look at that and say, well, there's you can look at the problems there and say, should we have been more savvy about how the private sector was going to respond to those kinds of investment opportunities? Or should we have brought in alongside our sort of price objective a much stronger sustainability of supply or capacity type objective? Now, the way you would do that in a government department versus independent regulators would have, right, and so I think there's been a
Ofgem could have done that.
Well, there's a balance between their objectives on that's been struck. So I think you'd have to look at that and say, to have not done that, could that have been something that Ofgem or Ofwat could have just brought that expertise in and thought of those things independently? Is it something that government could or should have done, or some combination of the two? But yes, there were certainly perspectives that were missed on that. Or even if they weren't missed, I think the other way of arguing it would be to say that a short-term focus on consumer prices might have squeezed out some of the other considerations, even if people were aware of them.
Right. I think something's gone terribly wrong when nobody can ever think strategically. Mr. Baker, here's our strategic thinker.
Well, thank you, Chair.
Pleasure.
Kind praise indeed. Not sure if that will be realised in the course of questions, but we have covered some of this ground already, Matthew, to an extent, but we're keen to understand your views around the latest review that's been announced into public bodies last month by the government, because we'd like to know why previous review programmes haven't successfully simplified and rationalised the public bodies landscape more. You have talked about that as being, since 2010, a significant reduction in the number of public bodies, but that's kind of plateaued since 2017. So why hasn't there been greater rationalisation and simplification around the number of public bodies we have?
Since 2017? I mean, I guess one could say probably that a lot of the low-hanging fruit had been picked. So some of the bodies that were cut at an earlier stage were like advisory, non-departmental public bodies, quite small and quite easy to get rid of. And once the lower the number becomes, the harder it is incrementally to find more to remove. I think also that there was some need for public bodies to do more as powers were repatriated post-Brexit in 2016. So there were extra responsibilities as well in place. I think the current review programme, I think what's potentially really positive about it is that the letters to departments could enable the reviews to look across a field, so like environmental regulation, for instance, rather than body by body, which has tended to be the approach of the previous one. So that would be the opportunity, I would say, is to look at it sort of holistically in a departmental level. However, I do think in general that the current approach is more reminiscent of the letters that Jacob Rees-Mogg sent in 2022 asking departments to identify bodies to merge or close than it is reminiscent of the previous iterations of a full-scale public bodies review programme. So announcing that you're going to have a really quick and dirty exercise and that you are looking for bodies to merge or close rather prejudges the outcome that you're pursuing. And so I'm nervous that the government will have boxed itself into a position where it is looking for a particular set of outcomes from this process and looking for them very quickly.
But given that there's been, in this 8-year period, such a minimal reduction in the number of public bodies, isn't it right to say that we've got too many? We need to look at how many there are. I mean, you did say that the savings might be moderate, but there have been savings in terms of reduction in numbers of public bodies previously.
I mean, it's always worth looking, and I would never argue against looking. But I would just say we have been around this many times, and where people have not found it easy to grasp is working out which functions should be eliminated. So I think if you're able to look at the functions that public bodies are performing and say the state no longer needs to do this thing, then that will give you a material reduction in cost. But historically, these exercises have yielded very few of those examples. They have tended towards the reorganisational restructuring of what is already there.
Well, it could be that the state does need to do these things, but it shouldn't be done by a public body. It should be taken under control of ministers.
Right, that's absolutely fine. Where that can be, where that is likely to be helpful. But I think the sort of the missing piece here is in a way, and the sort of the three tests are an attempt at it. But the government needs to have a view of what it wants to do at arm's length and what it doesn't want to do at arm's length. And the answer, it seems to me that less is not necessarily an answer. That's not a principled explanation for when you think a public body is appropriate and that kind of governance helps you or doesn't help you.
But the government has said it will have, and you said the three tests should be revised in terms of its approach to this process. And the government has raised up the potential, I think, of potentially legislation around this, which would give, I think, Parliament a great opportunity to actually consider the strategic approach around what should be the role of public bodies in the future. But it has said there will be 4 principles that will guide its approach. And what's your view in those principles? It would seem to be perhaps a bit unfair to just to compare it to Jacob Rees-Mogg saying search and destroy a public body in your area, as compared when the government has set out and say no, we will have an approach which is informed by 4 principles in terms of the futures of public bodies.
Well, I think the principles are helpful. So clear accountability and oversight procedures. Yes, those should be in place. I think if they are not found, there is then a question as to whether the first response to that should be to abolish the body or whether it should be to establish clear accountability and oversight procedures. But yes, eliminate waste, inefficiency and duplication, absolutely. That could be done either by shared services between existing bodies, merging bodies together, bringing bodies back into government. There are various ways of doing that, but it's definitely a valuable objective. Avoid ALBs set up to manage stakeholder groups. Definitely shouldn't be what they're for. So I'd agree with that. But yes, I'm not sure that I have many examples in mind that fit that category, but that they may well be out there. And clarify and test the need for independent regulation and oversight. That makes absolute sense. There's nothing in there that's I think unhelpful, but I don't think that those 4 criteria add up to a strategic view as to when you think something should be in a public body and when it shouldn't.
Although it seems to me some of them would do. I mean, for example, Mr. Lamont talked about the, in fact, proliferation of public bodies in Scotland over a period of time when the numbers in the rest of the UK reduced, certainly in England. And I would say stakeholder involvement would be one area of that where a body is created to, as a chair put it as well, solve a political problem, bring a group of stakeholders together. I mean, surely, I think yourself said that, that shouldn't be a reason to create a public body. And if there are examples of that out there, then that is something government should address.
An interesting area that you could look at, which is sort of probably out with this exercise but related, is the world of ombuds schemes, so complaints bodies. They do not receive the same kind of scrutiny as the public bodies landscape, and it's not clear where policy on those is owned in government, actually. But I think if you were going to look for organisations that may come closer to meeting that criteria, that would be where I would start.
That's helpful advice. And do you think the 4 principles which government has set up, do you think they are likely to bring about more closures of public bodies than in previous reviews, or how successful do you think they are likely to be in achieving that outcome?
I don't know. I would be reluctant to measure success in that way. I would measure success on, is accountability and oversight improved? Is there less waste and inefficiency? And are we sure we know why independent regulation and oversight is in place? So that's how I would measure success, not in terms of whether the numbers have been cut or not.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Laird.
Thank you very much. I mean, it's very interesting what you're saying. I mean, the question fundamentally seems to be not whether or not an arm's length body should exist. It's how do we undertake these processes that they're currently tasked to do. I mean, once they're already established, as has been already covered, there's a level of tendency to forget about their existence. Do you think that departments should be required to review the public bodies that they sponsor?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that these kind of sequential review processes, sort of led by the Cabinet Office, are quite important. I mean, we've seen over time that they become less comprehensive. They become sort of more targeted. So you'll have I think in the last iteration, an initial self-assessment within departments before you decide whether you're going to do a full review. And I think that makes sense because some of these processes do take quite a lot of time and resource to do. But absolutely, departments should be looking at the bodies. The other way of approaching that question would be to say, should it be departments who are looking at this, or somebody more independent who's looking at this?
An arm's length body.
Well, yeah. Or an independent reviewer, and so the previous review programme would have independent lead reviewers, but you'd often have the sponsorship team heavily involved in establishing the terms of reference and supporting the reviewer. And I think while it's right that departments, certainly the review should happen, I think from a resource perspective it's inevitable that departments and sponsor teams who are close to the body are going to be heavily involved. But I think making sure that the review doesn't just look at the body, but also looks in a clear-eyed way at the department and at the relationship between the department and the body, and whether that is working properly as a whole, is really important. And for that, you need the expert, the independent reviewer, to have a significant role in it. I also think, as I said before, that there's a risk sometimes with those reviews that it's body by body. Whereas in terms of the kinds of decision-making we're describing here, it's really the function that you want to look at. So trying to work out a way of reviewing function by function, whether the functions are necessary, whether there's duplication, how they could be made more efficient would be helpful.
I mean, it does feel that one of the risks of unitary government is that we've categorised an awful lot of organisations, certainly in your initial opening sort of comments around this, as potentially falling into the definition of being an arm's length body. I think that the BBC would struggle very heavily against any notion that they had any involvement directly with government whatsoever, as I think we spend quite a lot of time trying to do ourselves. Similarly, local and devolved government or bodies reporting to those really, I think, would feel it was inappropriate to have their particular arm's length bodies attached to the overall sort of definition of arm's length bodies in relation to national government. Attempts have been made to try to standardise the various types of arms length bodies according to the type of function they perform. How successful do you think this has been?
Well, I mean, from the previous conversation, somewhat successful. I guess there was an exercise in the mid-2010s that reduced the kind of the arm's length body taxonomy down from 11 to the 3 that we were describing earlier. The problem is that there were still a lot of legacy bodies in the other categories, and not everything that's been set up since has been classified at all. So that is some sort of narrow progress, but there's a lot more to do, and I think it would be beneficial to conduct an exercise to try and tidy that up, but it would be a lot of work, and so the other ways around that would be to kind of almost to sideline the taxonomy a little bit and to say, you know, we don't as government want necessarily to focus on whether a body is in a particular category, but to focus on the decisive aspects of its independence or its operations that we think matter, like whether it sets its own strategic framework or not, whether it's boards fiduciary or not, whether it's staffed by civil servants or not. So I think the problem with the current taxonomy is that you have a couple of sort of, or a now reduced number of sort of cookie cutter structures that you're trying to impose on the operations of a body, whereas actually what you're really looking at is a few parameters along which you need to make a decision about how the funding works, how the staffing works, how the legislation works, etc. And so what would be in a way helpful is to clarify what those parameters are and where each function should sit on it.
More of a matrix than
I think so. But then, you know, you've got the legacy of a you know, the taxonomy with the flaws that we've already discussed that's in place for existing bodies. But I think if you laid that kind of matrix over it, you'd be able to talk in more common sense terms about why public bodies have particular characteristics and others don't.
Would it be better then to do it on a case-by-case basis, trying to come up with a clear definition of what it is, or to have standardised definitions that we're trying to put them all into?
So I think that would be an argument for doing it on a case-by-case basis, but with that, in a way, selecting from a menu on in that sort of matrix form.
Do you think all public bodies should be categorised and possibly standardised rather than just arm's length bodies?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
But I think then there's the only caveat to that would be the administrative effort of doing that, which if you go out from central government into devolves and local particularly, there's a lot of opacity as to what's there, and so it would be a major exercise to draw that together. Question whether that's something you want the Cabinet Office to devote the amount of resource that would be required to doing, or again whether you're happy that somebody in the system knows what's going on there. But yes, clearly, I mean, ideally one would have a greater understanding of what was out there.
I can't say I've ever seen one of these framework documents involved in setting up an arm's length body, so I don't really know what goes into it. I would imagine, sort of given, as I said, ministerial biographies that I've read of late, that a number of them would be quite keen to understand the structures much better themselves. You've got Tony Benn's sort of 5 questions about power, and I was wondering if they really fit into one of these documents. You know, what power have you got? Where did you get it from? In whose interest do you exercise it? To whom are you accountable? And how can we get rid of you? And I suspect the last of those would be the most interesting one for a minister who's feeling the limits of their power in dealing with one of these bodies. Are these the kind of concepts that are set out in one of these framework documents?
Most of them, yes. How it can be abolished, I'm not sure whether that's in the framework document or just sort of given. If the body's legislated for, then abolishing can require legislation. If it's not legislated for, then it can be just a matter of ministerial decision. And this was interesting in the abolition of Public Health England. Ministers laboured for a while under the assumption that they needed legislation to abolish it, and then discovered that they didn't need legislation and just did it. So actually, in a lot of cases, the ministers can abolish bodies more easily than they think.
One last question from me. How effective is departmental oversight over the public bodies they sponsor?
As you've heard me say probably a few times already this morning, variable. I mean, I think there's some very good practice. I would say, and that sort of, if you like, sponsorship function of the team in the department that looks after the body is not just about oversight. When it's done well, it's also about opening doors around government, integrating the body into the activity of government so that it understands what it's supposed to be doing, has the necessary access to the minister when it needs it, and is able to really deliver on its objectives in lockstep with government. So it's not just an oversight compliance type function that they perform. I think from what we've seen, it does depend on the size and profile of the body. Sometimes you can see government departments almost building shadows to the body in the department and overseeing them very, very intensively. Some smaller bodies can be neglected, and I think you gave the example earlier of a body that the minister wasn't aware of. And I think there is a risk that those teams can end up duplicating functions that are performed inside the body over time, in an effort to sort of check and, if you like, second guess it. And that's where you end up with some inefficiency, where you end up with the department feeling, I haven't got enough confidence in what the body is doing. I need to do the same work to make sure that I'm happy with what's happening in the body. And that is obviously a cause of inefficiency when it happens. I think. But in general, it's variable, but it needs to try and avoid being just like compliance type oversight. There needs to be the right degree of senior oversight from people in the department. You sometimes see where sponsorship is concentrated in a dedicated team at a department rather than happening in the relevant policy teams. You can have one say director responsible for multiple bodies, and that can mean that they're too thinly spread over the bodies that they're looking at. So I think that can be sometimes a risk. And I think there's also a bit of a need to kind of talk up the value of good sponsorship in government. It's not always seen as a sort of premier destination for a civil servant to work in the sponsorship team, whereas actually making that relationship between the body and government work smoothly in the interests of ministerial objectives is a really difficult and important role that should be highly valued.
So should there be a bit of standardisation or some guidance around how departments should be relating to their arm's length bodies?
I mean, there already is some. There's a guidance code on sponsorship that departments will look at. So I think it's more a question of prioritising that and being disciplined about keeping the sponsorship at a high level.
Thank you.
I want to sort of ask two grit in the oyster type questions, which slightly pick up on what Mr. Lamb has been asking. It's quite easy to mark your own homework and give yourself an A star at every time. So a sponsoring department is by definition, at official level at least, going to strike up a good relationship with officials working in the arm's length or public body. And likewise, ministers potentially with senior people in that organisation too. That doesn't necessarily provide the critical friend, does it, when it comes to review? Nor does it give any sense of parity of assessment across HMG PLC. Is there not arguably some considerable merit, although it has capacity demands, that in actual fact it's Cabinet Office that reviews how that operational matrix is working between the sponsoring department and that body which it is sponsoring, and therefore notionally accountable for.
Yeah, I think I wouldn't underestimate how frictional the relationship between the sponsor team and the body can sometimes be, in the sense that the sort of frustrations that you've articulated at the beginning of this session around how ministers can feel when a body doesn't do what they want it to do, day to day, that tension is experienced in the relationship between the sponsorship team and their sort of counterparts in the body. So there is often a kind of there can be tensions there, as well as the good working relationships that you would expect. But I do agree with you. I think there is always a risk to an organisation marking its own homework. That's why the role of the independent reviewer is important. And I think the risk of just getting the Cabinet Office to do it is they're not close enough to what the body does to really understand what's happening. So you need to involve the sponsorship teams to some extent.
Yeah, but there's merit in that, isn't there? Because then they actually have to make, in very clear terms, their case, rather than well, you know how we do it.
Yes, no, I absolutely agree with you. And I think, yeah, I guess what I'm wondering is, rather than taking it... the revealed outcome of this is that over the years, fewer reviews have been done and have had to be prioritised because they take up a lot of bandwidth and have not been able to be completed to a timetable. My worry is that without a very significant change in resource and structure, saying we're no longer going to ask the departments to do this, we're going to ask the Cabinet Office to do all X hundred of them, would create an unmanageable situation. So I agree with what you're saying, and I think the pragmatic response to that is to say, what steps can be taken at Cabinet Office level to ensure the independence and robustness of the reviews that are being taken place? So I'm wondering whether there are incremental steps from where we are to where you're describing.
No, I take that. And it's quite interesting how you defaulted to presuming that my question just then was about a sort of friendly and cosy relationship between sponsoring department and the body, and therefore things would just sort of rub on. If there's an antagonistic relationship, there could be a who will rid me of this troublesome priest type of approach, that no matter what they do and how well they do it, they're an irritant, so they've got to go. And that might have upside. It might have considerable downside, which is why that dispassionate set of eyes from one department, which one thinks about the Cabinet Office, how it has evolved to effectively being the key holder to managing delivery. The Prime Minister says this, the Chancellor is then given the job of making sure that this turns into reality across government. And I don't say this is a direct criticism of you, because I know it's what is said. I get slightly worried when, yes, we can see the merit in doing this particular job in this particular way, but do you know, it would take up an awful lot of time. And we might have to hire 4 new people to do it. That shouldn't be, I ask this as a question, that should not be, should it, a precluder from doing the right job properly. That it might take time. It might actually require some invest to save.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And so then maybe there's a solution which says that, you have the self-assessment process that they had under the last arrangement. You have the independent reviewers supported by the department as an option, but where you have the resource and you see the priority, you have it staffed as well as led from somewhere else. And I mean, I agree with you, that would give us certainly a more independent perspective on what's happening. But the important thing would be just to make sure that if you are going to do that, you really have got to resource it properly, because otherwise the risk is that people will skate across the surface because they haven't got the background or able to get into the depth of what's actually happening.
I mean, Cabinet Office could ask some legitimately probing questions. I mean, I was asked a question at the weekend by a North Dorset farmer, to which I didn't have an answer and still don't, which is, why do we have, both operating under the auspices of DEFRA, both Natural England and the Environment Agency? Now, DEFRA might not, I'm not picking on DEFRA per se, DEFRA might not ask that question because it has always been, for as long as operational living memory can recall. I mean, I can remember when we still had the National Rivers Authority, for example. But Cabinet Office, alert to and alive to its responsibilities of delivering, in the current government iteration, missions, but it will be called other things by other parties in different times, they can ask the fundamental question of the first starting point of why. Why was this created? What problem was it sought? Was it established to find a solution to? Has it done it, and has it now just grown like Topsy to justify its own existence? Or did we just was there a problem? Was there a knee-jerk reaction? Something needs to be done. Let's create something, without actually going back and going, well, actually, these three organisations all have powers and remit to do that. But no, let's just create something new. So I suppose my open-ended question is, how much merit is there of having one set of administrative senior eyes over this whole piece of work? Because I think we're all understanding that there is a piece of work that needs to be done. And if there is merit, is it best to have it coordinated and delivered by the Cabinet Office?
Yes, and my understanding is that at the level at which this is happening, which is fairly high level, that is what's happening. Departments are sending in their responses to the Cabinet Office. They'll be looking at it, forming a view, and then going out to others to formulate that. So yes, I think that's right, that they should take that view.
But I'd be interested in your understanding, because we had Kath Little before us last week, and we were quite keen as a committee to try to establish who ticks the ultimate box, or Caesar-like either puts the thumb up or the thumb down. And I think we got to a stage, well, if the Cabinet Office took a different view to a Secretary of State and a permanent Secretary, there would, of course, be private conversations to seek to persuade. And then if there's a logjam or an impasse in all of that, there seems to be nobody who can have to, I suppose, apart from the Prime Minister, who could say, no, my decision is X. There's a danger of this just being a little bit too chummy. Isn't there?
Yeah, so
not strategic.
I mean, I guess in the sense that the ultimate decision maker on the DEFRA bodies, for instance, will be the Secretary of State for DEFRA, and it would be better to take a view that is entirely abstract from DEFRA to form a view on those bodies. I would like to think that the Secretary of State for DEFRA, and I know that even previous people in that post have looked at these bodies and been thinking about how they might reconfigure that. Because those bodies are all in DEFRA, the Secretary of State has an opportunity and a remit to think across them. I think where it's harder is where you have bodies that are across different Secretaries of State. So, for instance, food, which would be relevant to DEFRA, but also to health, and also to DBT to some extent, and so making decisions on those can be harder in that departmental structure. But my understanding of it formally is that the Secretaries of State are the final decision makers unless they are politically overruled. Or unless there is a right round that agrees across departments in a certain course of action. So it may be that you could do a review in Cabinet Office. Some individual departmental Secretaries of State might disagree with the overall outcomes of the review, but there'll be a right round and a negotiation on the review as a whole, and which bodies were going to be changed or merged. And then a negotiation over the details, which would come out with then a plan to be implemented. Yeah. But it's not straightforward.
But doesn't that speak to something which I think has been thematic in this session, that so much of our national life has become decision-taking averse. This is my decision, we're going to do it this way, this is the argument that I'm deploying to advocate for that position. I hope we'll be successful, it may fail, and we've heard from the Chancellor in another session that he's quite keen to encourage failure, if you will, or the fear of failure shouldn't be a prohibitor for trying something. Negotiation, right round, cosy chats at the Athenaeum, in inverted commas, whatever may be done. We just need some, surely to improve productivity, delivery, value for money, democratic accountability, active citizenship, people thinking the government is on their side and they can, to take Mr. Lamb's point, they can elect them or they can kick them out. We have evolved a system which is the absolute antithesis of that we keep the ball bouncing up and down and very few people want to take a decision in case it's the wrong one. Am I being overly cynical or overly critical?
No, I mean, I'm trying to think. I mean, I don't know if this is a good example or not, but there's a recent point about Ofgem floating differential charging for customers on different incomes. And that, I think, is an outgrowth of a sort of long-standing worry they've had about vulnerable customers and being responsible for maintaining supply to vulnerable customers, but not really having a steer from government as to how to handle that. And so you could look at that in two ways. Either they're thrusting themselves into a distributional question which is not their business, or they're feeling obliged to take distributional decisions because they don't think that departments or ministers are taking the decisions they need to take. I guess I raise that as an example because it illustrates that it's not necessarily the delegation of energy regulation to Ofgem that causes that decision not to be made. And there are sometimes situations where public bodies are alive and waiting for a steer that doesn't necessarily come. You can see it, for instance, in where we have the current desire that regulators will think about growth and the growth objective. I think it's actually quite difficult for a lot of them because it's not clear what kind of growth they are necessarily pursuing. Is it clean growth? Is it short-term growth? Is it any particular sectors?
What is? I just say any growth.
Any growth, but sometimes that might be contradictory depending on where you invest. And so I think there is definitely scope for strategic decisions to be made on those kinds of things, and for a more decisive approach to some of those issues, if you want to put it like that. Yeah. And if that's made at that level, that's actually helpful for public bodies which are then trying to deliver their objectives in the context of that policy environment.
Yeah. It doesn't... Let's just look at sort of water, very, very briefly, because I'm conscious of time and PMQs is fine. But we have a shortage of... you've mentioned a couple of times about sort of arm's length bodies, public bodies taking long-term, strategic, non-political, the big picture type decisions. Key pressure, keep water prices down for the consumer. Now we have the cleanest drinking water in the world at, I think, on average is about 11p per day. There's no commodity elsewhere that is as reasonably priced. But keep water prices down has fundamentally contributed to a lack of strategic decision-taking with regards to reservoir expansion, capital investment by the water companies, which has, of course, led to what is a great hue and cry about how we manage domestic pollution, storm drains, etc. So we have this idea that these bodies can take strategic long-term decisions, but if they're fettered by keep prices down at all costs, cost of living crisis, etc. That just goes out of the window. So a system that seems to me to have been architectured to do one thing, in theory can, but more often than not, either doesn't, for want of appetite, or can't, because of higher up the food chain decisions being taken. So it seems we're in a very complex, messy landscape where, to give voice to a common theme during the last year, during the general election campaign, nothing seems to work. Which then means you have to ask yourself the question, is it because those bodies which are charged with making things work are not of themselves working in the way which was initially envisaged? I suppose that's the essay question.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, the only thing I can say to that is that we are planning some research on infrastructure investment, and
well, we look forward
to encourage it. So that is coming. I think with the significant benefit of hindsight on this example, one can certainly look back and say that the objective to keep prices low was overweighted relative to other objectives in terms of the sustainability of supply. It is not clear to me whether that is because where that came from, whether that came from government or whether that came from Ofwat. I'm not in a position, I think, to answer that question.
And I doubt that anybody is, and therein speaks quite a lot of the problem about accountability for decisions taken. Who took them and why? How were they questioned about it in this place, etc.?
I'm not sure that's unanswerable. I just think I don't personally know the answer.
Okay. Go away and put a pearl flannel on your head and think great thoughts. Have a two-pipe solution, as Sherlock Holmes might have advocated, and if you want to drop us a note on it with further thoughts, you're very welcome. Colleagues, conscious of the time, anybody else want to chip in at this stage? Thank you very much indeed. Mr. Gill, thank you for giving us lots of food for thought. I think in the words of the song, there's probably more questions than answers. That's not your fault, but that's not a surprise on the first session of an inquiry, which I think is going to be in-depth and hopefully considered. But thank you all very much indeed. Order.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.